The following podcast is a presentation of Project Entertainment Network.
Hello, welcome to Staring into the Abyss. I'm your host, Richard Gerlach. With me, as always, is Michael Patrick Hicks.
Hello.
Matt Brandenburg.
Hark. Hello.
And a very special guest, the author of Mr. Suicide, Nicole Cushing.
Howdy, y'all.
Hey.
Thank you for joining us.
I love that was the book you picked for her.
That's the first book I read from Nicole. Actually, the second book I read from Nicole, but it's a book that really stuck out to me.
Yeah. It's a good one.
Thank you.
It's a good one. Thank you for joining us tonight and Staring into the Abyss for a special nighttime episode.
Yeah.
To our audience at home, we typically record in the mornings, so this is a little bit different for us.
That's why we're so peppy at all times, I guess.
Yeah, we're so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Sunday morning. We'll see what happens on a Wednesday night.
It's when our nerves are the most raw is Sunday morning, so things just come out.
Right.
Pretty much. And we actually have a nice throwback episode to a story I think all our listeners are going to be familiar with, but that is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe.
It's been a while since I've read this one, so it was fun to get back into it.
It was. It's always good to be able to read a Poe story and have a reason to go back and revisit this.
I forgot how crazy the style is on this one. It's just like, it's right from the beginning.
As told by our totally sane narrator.
Yeah, I think whenever you need to kind of demand that at the very beginning, that you have to emphasize that you really are sane, that you really not mad. It doesn't exactly, if you have to go out of your way to do that, that doesn't necessarily weigh in your favor.
No.
Agreed 100%. If you have to prove your sanity, you're probably not sane.
Or prove you're truthful by yelling true.
But before we fully dive into The Telltale Heart, we'd like to give kind of a rundown of some books or TV shows or movies we watched this last week or read this last week. I only have one for us tonight. Surprise.
Uh-oh.
And that is Pressure by Jeff Strand.
Oh.
Nice.
Have you ever read this book, Matt? I know you've read it, Mike.
Yeah, I did the audio a while back.
No, the only Jeff Strand I think I've read was Clowns vs. Spiders.
I gotta fix that. This book it's wild. It's not as funny as Clowns vs. Spiders. It's more kind of Jeff trying to write a serious thriller, but like he still has comedic elements in there. And by the end, it's just one of the darkest books I've ever read. It's fucked.
That's one way to do it.
But the plot of the book is it follows our narrator who is bullied into stealing condoms from a local store because the cool kids won't let him in the cool kids club if he doesn't steal a thing of condoms.
Okay.
And
out of all the things you could steal, that makes sense.
And he gets
You don't remember doing that, Matt?
Never to get into the cool kids club.
And he gets sent to boarding school because he did one bad thing.
Oh, okay. I thought that was the secret cool kids was the boarding school.
And then he meets someone in boarding school who follows him for the rest of his life.
Oh.
And who has an obsession with our main character and is not the best person in the world.
Is it a giant condom?
It's not a giant condom. It is a sociopath who's obsessed with murder.
Ah.
And he's trying to make our protagonist give in to these murderous desires because he thinks he will also be a partner in bloody murders with him.
Why does he think that when the guy was
it doesn't really doesn't really explain. He just has a feeling about him.
Yeah, it's just kind of like that supervillain superhero dynamic, like a Batman and Joker. Like a Joker is there to test Batman and eventually make him realize his full potential.
and he sees that via the fact that he stole condoms?
No, he doesn't know he stole condoms. They're all in the boarding school together, but they just hang out a lot. And he's like, and then when our main character leaves boarding school, he goes to college and surprised that kid's back at college with him. And then after college, he gets married, has a kid, and guess who shows up again?
Guess who the kid is? It's this guy.
That would have been a twist.
It would have been a twist, but the book gets really dark and really fucked up.
Yeah.
It's really good. Like if you want a more serious Jeff Strand novel, I would highly recommend it. I had a really great time with it, and even though it's more serious, it's still kind of funny here and there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I recall there being a lot of particular Strandisms, the kind of humor in there, so even though it is more serious in tone, it still has that fucked up sense of humor to it.
Yeah, so the first half's a bit more funny than the second half is.
Yeah, by the second half, it's just it's dark.
But it's one of those books that, like, every time I read Jeff Strand, it makes me realize how masterful of at dialogue he is. Like, he's one of the best dialogue writers I've read in a long time, and it's a book I highly recommend. So if you have Kindle Unlimited or you haven't read Jeff Strand before, give Pressure a try. It's a really solid horror thriller that I think you'll have a good time with.
Yeah, check out the audiobook too.
2 plugs. Mike, what about you?
I went through this past week, as you and our listeners probably are aware, I've spent the last few weeks going through kind of aquatic horror, terror island, sea terror reads. So the latest one that I went through was Christine Morgan's Trenchmouth.
I love that title.
It's a fantastic title, and it's kind of a big summer blockbuster aquatic horror book. A lot of popcorn to sit and read this one. It's just such a lot of fun, and it's got like everything but the kitchen sink kind of approach to it.
Nice.
So you've got this underwater science facility. You've got mad scientists conducting trial experiments on humans to try and create genetically engineered fish people so that we can survive the coming apocalypse of climate change by making the ocean our new home.
All right.
And you've also got a giant, centuries-old anglerfish, primordial anglerfish that lives deep in the trench and is the queen of the deep.
All right.
And she doesn't take too kindly to these pesky humans invading her domain.
Well, that makes sense.
Doing crazy things in her waters.
I mean, but they're making like subjects for her, so.
Well, that may be.
Oh, did I guess?
That is a possibility. So you've got this really fun riff that kind of at times feels a bit like Jaws meets Jurassic Park with a bit of Aquaman, X-Men.
Oh my God.
Kind of shit mixed in there with some really crazy body horror. If you know anything about how anglerfish reproduce, like Morgan does not do a whole lot of embellishing beyond increasing the size of the anglerfish, but it's some real hardcore body horror how anglerfish populate.
So I need to Google that, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Should I have safe search on?
I'm already ahead of you.
I don't know if you need safe search or not, but it gets pretty crazy.
Okay.
And you've got a lot of ribald humor mixed in for good measure, but it is just an absolute blast. Bloody and gory. You've got fish body horror, which is awesome. There's a really nice, subtle environmental message threaded throughout because it is ultimately about science gone awry and mankind's propensity for sticking its nose in places it doesn't belong and fucking around with things we shouldn't be fucking around with and invading the territory of creatures that we weren't even aware are there and the kind of impact humanity has on nature. But mostly it's just a hell of a lot of fun.
It sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, I dug this one a hell of a lot. I think some readers might be a little put off by a kind of open-ended finale, but I thought it worked really well here. There are some really neat hints going on as to what is going on in the background as a result of these experiments, and it's got me hoping for Trenchmouth 2. So I'm just going to put that out there.
The trenching?
Yeah, trench harder.
Yeah, that sounds pretty awesome.
It was a ton of fun. I highly, highly recommend that one if you're looking for a new aquatic horror book that it feels familiar but does a lot of neat original things and takes some pretty surprising and shocking twists along the way.
I can get down with that for sure.
Oh, me too. Matt, what about you?
Oh, man. All right. So I know we're going to be talking about Layman's Island in its next episode, so I won't go into anything on that. I have lots of thoughts on that. So that one I won't talk about. I think the last episode I had talked about, I'm still in the middle of Ligotti's conspiracy against the human race, and it was kind of nice to go back into that after reading Island. I think as dark as that one is, I know, but I feel like Island covered some things I did not want to really read about. So I was good.
So Ligotti was a softer, lighthearted read for you after that one.
Yeah, just a bit. Well, yes. But I've already kind of talked a bit about that. So I did want to talk about, I finally finished Invincible and I loved it. I love the ending. I don't know if everybody here has watched it all. I don't want to spoil anything, but
how fucked up was that last episode, Matt?
Oh, that was intense. I mean, like, and it's funny because we were watching like maybe an episode a night, and then I think we got to the second to last one where something happens, and we were just like, okay, I guess we can stay up and finish this because we need to know what happens. Yeah, I dug it a lot. I mean, I think I even like the ending too, like, because you kind of get some nice touching moments there, despite how dark it got. And I kind of want to read the comic now. I haven't read this comic at all, so I know to keep going. And they tease a lot there at the end, so I was like, oh man. I didn't expect the robot thing. That was a surprise. I was like, oh, okay. And, when you bring in some cloning stuff, that gets a little wild. But yeah, that ending was awesome.
The comic is a lot less intense when it comes to the violence that the show kind of puts a bigger emphasis on.
Oh yeah, they go all out.
The comic is kind of, best way to put it is it's a subversive comic that is more of a parody of Golden Age superheroes, as it turns the Golden Age superhero tropes on their heads. Where the show doesn't really do that, and it kind of embraces the more nihilistic and darker elements of Invincible.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking that too, because, like, I mean, very clearly that he's Superman or Mr. Incredible or whatever is Mr. Incredible, Omni-Man. That's where my mind's at. Omni-Man is basically Superman, and I loved what he could do, because it was kind of like, well, yeah, if you took Superman and made him a realistic, of course he's gonna blast through people and tear people apart very easily.
All I'll say is the subway scene is one of the most fucked up things I think I've ever seen in an animated show.
All of that. Oh man, I was not expecting him to just be like, when are you gonna stop and listen to me?
Well, the show's been renewed for 2 more seasons.
That's exciting.
So I'm excited to see more Alan the Alien. He's my favorite character. So it's gonna be a good time.
Yes. I think
And
so.
as someone who's kind of read pretty far into the comics, it goes into some interesting directions.
That's good. Yeah. I love, because they set up a lot of random things. And when we were getting close to the end, I was like, how are they going to tie all this together? And they actually do a pretty good job tying it all up. I mean, obviously there's open-ended ending, but some of the stuff they kind of set up early gets answered at the end there.
Oh, yeah. But Nicole, what about you? Any recommendations?
Yeah, I'm interested in the history of transgressive literature. And so I'm reading right now a novel written in 1626 called The Swindler. And it's described as a comic yet brutal and sordid account of a servant who wants to become a gentleman but ends up as a card sharp and a common criminal. Yeah, and it's published it's actually more of a novella than a novel, but it's published along with another transgressive Spanish novella called Lazarillo de Tormes, I believe that's how it's pronounced, by Penguin Classics in a collection called Two Spanish Picaresque Novels. And so, the picaresque novels were like these, kind of rogues going through all these different ups and downs in their economic and social circumstances as they kind of freed themselves from oppressive circumstances and tried to get more freedom, but oftentimes they fell into even more sordid circumstances. And like I said, I'm just really interested in the history of the transgressive impulse in fiction. I've been searching out, it's kind of like searching out your parents, right? It's like your forebears. Where did this all come from? And so it's been an interesting trip. So that's what I've been reading. And I've been watching a couple of very interesting things. My husband, for my birthday, because I have a birthday in a few days, he got me Twin Peaks: The Return on DVD. So I just now watched the first episode today of that and was obviously mind blown by everything that I watched. That was cool. And then also in the last week, I've watched an old film from the 80s, Communion, based on the work of at least alleged nonfiction by Whitley Strieber, in which he describes his alleged alien abduction. And Christopher Walken is Whitley Strieber, and it is so fucking weird. And it's like a movie about alien abduction if it was written by aliens, because like the social cues of the characters really don't match up to what you would expect. And of course you have Christopher Walken just like chewing up the scenery and everything. And it really deserves the riff tracks treatment. Even beyond that, but at the same time, there is a little part that's like genuinely disturbing. And so it's kind of like, it's cartoonish, but it's also nightmarish. And that's definitely my jam. Right. And so, yeah, just fascinating. And I tried to read the Strieber book, but it felt very padded to me. It just didn't really, you kind of get the gist of it about halfway through. And I didn't find it particularly frightening or anything. It just didn't really, just as a story, it didn't do anything for me. And I'm not sure how to take the claims of it being nonfiction. I think I'd probably land a little bit more on the skeptical side of that. But at the same time, the whole thing is fascinating. It's just something I feel very intrigued by. So that's the media, the weird media that I've been pouring into my already weird brain. Not exactly helping me tone things down.
Understandable. I remember when Twin Peaks: The Return first was airing, and I was living in China at the time, and I was trying to introduce my friends to Twin Peaks, and they were just like, "What the fuck is wrong with you?"
I I need to watch that. I've watched the original, but I haven't watched this new one that's out. So
It's really good.
that's what I've heard. I heard Matthew Lillard's in it, so I'm like, all right, I can check that out.
Matthew Lillard is in it, and like the first few episodes, it's David Lynch at just like they just gave him money and just said, do what you want to do with it.
That's perfect.
And it's glorious.
And I feel like I've seen Communion. Is there a scene with little robots flying?
Yeah, there's like one little robot that kind of like comes through like space towards Whitley Strieber while he's awaking from a dream or something, and it's kind of like a not really convincing looking robot, but it matches the description from the book. So, but that's part of what you see there.
Okay, because I was like,
yeah, I mean, it's available for free now on Amazon Prime. So if you're a Prime member, feel free to, as of this recording at least, it's free on Amazon Prime. So check it out, because it is something from the very beginning. It is just so odd, deliciously odd, and I love it.
Oh, man. Yeah, I need to rewatch that, because I remember the robot thing, and I just remember Christopher Walken being Christopher Walken, and that's about it.
Right, and then the actress who plays his wife is so hostile. They just, grating. And then you have a kid who is kind of very, annoyingly kind of like whiny and blah, and, and all this kind of thing. So you put them together, and it's this wonderful salad of dysfunction and oddity and very, but at the same time, like I said, occasionally kind of moving, because you could also see it as a story of Christopher Walken's character kind of starting to have issues with mental health. And if you look at it from that perspective, then there's something poignant about it, because this guy is, going through something, and his family is freaking out and that kind of thing. And I guess I kind of like the ambiguity of that.
I'm adding that to my watch list on Prime right now, actually. Oh, that'll be a fun one. Well, I will say, I think you'll enjoy the rest of Twin Peaks: The Return, Nicole. It gets pretty crazy, but it's all glorious.
Yeah, I mean, crazy is I like Lynch when he's unhinged. I think and especially I've enjoyed listening to interviews that he's given about the creative process, and his approach is very visual. He doesn't really feel at home with words. And so I've learned to kind of take his art in that spirit of basically approaching them as paintings that move and have sound. And I think I'm much more comfortable with his work after kind of getting an understanding of where he's coming from with it. It's very obviously very different than my own approach, which is I'm all about the words, and verbal skill is really what I'm more interested in, and I'm not as interested in the image. In fact, I watch very few movies, and or very few television shows. I was actually selected as a Nielsen family for the ratings, believe this or not, and I had to tell them that this television hasn't been on in 2 months, and so they tried to get me on as a radio ratings person. It's like, what is this, like 1990? Like talking on the radios. It's like I listen to podcasts, so, so it's, and of course the idea of like picking me out of a hat and I'm like representing the general population, it's kind of like, they don't really know me, it's like, just to be mischievous, it would be, like a fun idea to put like every weird ass like TV show I could come up with, or, just invent TV shows that I'm telling them that I'm watching, that don't but I'm too Midwestern to do that. It's like that idea just stays in my head. I can actually like mess with people, but yeah. Anyway, I don't know how I got off on that tangent, but yeah, Lynch is, I really have a lot of admiration for his work, so I'm not surprised to hear that y'all think I'll probably enjoy the rest of the Return. And I also want to watch Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, because I have not seen that yet, and I think some of that, having a grounding in that might help me a little bit with the Return as well.
It definitely will. There's one, I will say, I won't spoil anything for The Return, but there's one episode that is pretty much a silent movie. There's no dialogue at all in the entire episode. It's just all told through the visuals, and it's one of the best things I think I've ever watched.
Sounds amazing.
So, I mean, I'm a huge David Lynch fan myself. Like, I remember when I was in college, I took a film class, and the professor made us watch Blue Velvet.
Yes.
And, like, that's still one of my favorite movies to this day, but that movie is a fucking experience the first time you watch it.
Yeah, I watched it, and for some reason it's not because of the content was too objectionable or anything, but it's like I got interrupted while watching it, and so I never ended up finishing it. So, but I got to the part where like Dennis Hopper is being weird in his interactions with the woman, and someone is watching it, and that kind of thing. So I definitely need to go back and revisit that. I've seen Eraserhead. I've seen a lot of the early shorts actually that he did. And need to get the Elephant Man. I need to watch some of the like Mulholland Drive and those ones too, because I've just become more and more fascinated by Lynch in the last year.
And there's also his Dune adaptation.
Yeah.
Well, that one he did not have complete creative control on. So he always, if you go on YouTube and you watch these lectures that he gives or these interviews that he gives, he always talks to filmmakers about having final cut. And of course the audience all laughs and everything because the idea of having final cut in Hollywood is incredibly naive. But with Lynch, it's really based on the experience he had on Dune where he didn't have final cut. And he felt that was had a lot to do with the movie's failure. And so he always from that point on insisted on final cut. And he makes a good argument for it. It's like if they're trusting you, if they're giving you the money and they're trusting, they need to be completely behind you and they need to be, on board with your vision. And I like that idea a lot. I also found out from watching a lot of YouTube videos that David Lynch was offered the chance to direct the third Star Wars film, Return of the Jedi, and turned it down. And he describes, like, if you go into YouTube and you just kind of Google that or put it in YouTube, you can hear Lynch talking about why he didn't do it. And he basically had like a panic attack when he met with George Lucas and just knew that there was no way that he could do this. But, George Lucas's world and David Lynch's world were just too different. But yeah, I mean, it's something really amazing.
That would have been awesome.
Yeah. And so I probably would have been a better film, but then again, they wouldn't have been because, they would have hemmed David Lynch in and then it could have ruined David Lynch. Let's say that David Lynch did it and it was really successful. And then we wouldn't have all the real David Lynch. We would have like the pseudo David Lynch that got, kind of brought into the 80s Hollywood thriller thing, and you'd have like David Lynch directing Top Gun, kind of like you have this like smiley toothpaste kind of David Lynch, and you wouldn't really have David Lynch. He tucked into the Black Lodge that is Hollywood and become something else. So I think it didn't work out that way.
I can fully agree with that, and I don't know. I feel like we're better off having David Lynch making the movies and shows that he wants to make.
Yes.
Because I remember like the first time I saw Mulholland Drive, that movie also like fucked me up for a little bit too.
Yeah.
I have this anthology that's like a tribute to David Lynch. It's all like short stories and poems inspired by David Lynch.
Oh yeah, I think it's called like In Heaven Everything is Fine. Is that what?
I think it's that one.
Yeah.
And there's a poem that I always remember from that one. That's like the perfect Lynchian poem. That's just like, there's a door open and nobody's there. There's a door open and nobody's there. There's a door open and nobody's there. And I feel like that's pretty much a David Lynch vibe. But
yeah. Or there's somebody there and they're strange. They're like the high school or the townsperson who was wearing an eye patch and that they're a teenager still. from the original. I mean, it's or you open the door and there's you walk into the Black Lodge and there's the giant and the dwarf and everything. I mean, it's
and they're speaking in reverse.
Yeah, and they're speaking in backwards, and you need subtitles, and you have screaming Laura Palmer and everything. I mean, that's, screaming Laura Palmer freaks me out, and it takes it doesn't take a fair bit. I wouldn't want to say it takes a fair bit to freak me out, but that's not true, because if I see like a mouse or something, I get freaked out. So, but yeah, screaming Laura Palmer, if you just put into YouTube screaming Laura Palmer, you'll see that scene from the original Twin Peaks, and it's like, holy shit, that's disturbing, but it's disturbing.
I'm so surprised that original Twin Peaks made it on like mainstream American television in the early 90s.
Yeah, well, I mean, ABC at the time they were the third place network. And so they were doing a lot of experimental things. Like I can remember I was, so I have no problem with sharing my age because I'm very proud of my age. In a few days, I will be turning 48. So, and when Twin Peaks first debuted, it was when I was in high school. And even before, a couple of years before, ABC was really doing innovative things. Like there was a TV show with Bruce Willis and Sybil Shepherd called Moonlighting. And Moonlighting was kind of a romantic comedy about a detective agency, but they would also do like some interesting things with breaking the fourth wall. And they were just very, very different. And so ABC was taking chances. And I think also I would argue that creativity in America was in a healthier place back then, that there were definitely problems. You did not have the same recognition of the issues that we have with diversity and inclusion, in the 80s, for example. So I don't want to, put that on a pedestal or something and say that, everything was, look at that with rose-colored glasses. But at the same time, you did not have the influence of entertainment conglomerates being so decisive, being so omnipresent, to where I think the entertainment world today, and the artistic world, to the degree that we still have an artistic world, is really there's kind of tunnel vision set on it. There's certain conventions that are followed, and it's kind of like entertainment in the United States, or arts in the United States, is kind of like there's this road set up, and to travel on that road you have a vehicle of a certain size and a certain shape and a certain color, and only vehicles like that are allowed to travel on the road. And it's a big, vast road and can get to a lot of people. But if you try to take a unicycle onto that freeway, then you're going to get pulled over and told that you don't belong there. And so we don't see unicycles. And back in the 80s, it was possible. Max Headroom is another example of something where you could have really different sorts of TV programs, and people were at least willing to give it a try. And I think, I don't have a whole lot of interest in television. I don't have a whole lot of interest in movies. I'm mostly interested in movies to the extent that I'm interested in bad movies. I think the best movies that exist are movies that are bad, that kind of, that are entertaining. But I don't really know of too many good movies that I've watched recently. And so, but Lynch is like the exception that proves the rule. I mean, he's somebody who's kind of an outsider and has always been an outsider for the most part, and has been okay, kind of included in Hollywood, kind of like at a distance, at arm's length. And I think is just an intriguing character.
Well, do you know what else is a really good idea, Mike?
Uh-oh.
Chopping up people and hiding them in your floor?
And confessing it to the cops.
Yes, while you take them into the room and have a sit down.
Because you're so confident.
And sane.
Oh, yes. It's time to bust out the Telltale Heart, every third grader's favorite horror story. Maybe middle school, actually. I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely did not read this in third grade.
I don't know what I read in third grade, to be honest with you. But
Golden books.
Golden book.
Yeah, they did not have Edgar Allan Poe on the little golden book when I was a child.
The Edgar Allan Poe little golden books.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Actually, I have a what it was like classics comics or whatever, like from the 50s, where they tried to take like classic American authors and transport them into like or adapt them into comic book form. So I have like a Telltale Heart comic book, or it's a collection of Poe stories, and the Telltale Heart is in there. And so, I mean, you do see that kind of like approach. Classics Illustrated, I think that's what the series was called. And there's one, actually, it wasn't just American authors, because they had one about Frankenstein as well.
Yeah, I had the Frankenstein one as a kid.
And so there's this Poe one as well. And so and I think that it's interesting. I mean, I think I was exposed to it. Well, I grew up in Maryland, so first of all, it's like Poe, died in Maryland. We, when I was a kid, we went to the Edgar Allan Poe house in Baltimore, and an actor who was kind of decked out as Poe, kind of told us his life story and everything. And I've been to the Poe gravesite. I've been to the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, which I really, really encourage you to check out if you're ever in that area. It's like Baltimore has Poe's body, but I think Richmond has Poe's soul. If you go to the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, you'll see all kinds of wonderful things on there. The chair that he sat in, the bed that he slept in when he was a little boy, and yes, even a pair of Edgar Allan Poe's socks are on display. And you can see how tiny his feet were, and you can also look at original manuscripts. And you can see just how neat his handwriting was, bizarrely neat. And you can see first editions. And they have two cats who stroll around the grounds there, one named Edgar and one named Pluto. They're two black stray cats who just showed up one day. I think their mama was there too, and I think the mama found a different home. But these two cats have been at home in the Poe Museum for a couple of years now, and if you follow the Edgar Allan Poe Museum on Twitter, you will occasionally see these pictures of, Pluto and Eddie or Edgar kind of wandering around the grounds of the Poe Museum there. So, yeah, I mean, for me, I was exposed to Poe probably like first in middle school. And I think the way that this story was presented to me was as a morality tale of, here we have this person and, they're arrogant and, they get their comeuppance. But after I really had a re-encounter with Poe, probably about 3 or 4 years ago, when I started to read his stories again, I realized there's a whole other level to this, and that it's Poe, at least for my reading of this story, it's not as much of an EC Comics morality tale as it is more of a David Lynch kind of tale. And so I know I'll be eager to talk to you guys about that maybe a little bit more later.
I like that take of it. I can say, like, the Telltale Heart, I was taught it as kind of like a morality tale as well. Well, there's definitely a bit more going on in the story besides the basic, like, guilty conscience wins in the end, so don't do bad things.
Right.
There's a lot more strangeness and eeriness that goes on in this story.
You can analyze the story in a couple of different ways. One is, who's the protagonist and who's the antagonist? And you realize, as with so many Poe stories, that question ceases to make sense. And when applied to this story, because you could say, well, the madman is the protagonist, but then who's the antagonist? The madman is also the antagonist in a sense, because the madman is at war with himself. The madness is the antagonist, maybe, if you wanted to be interested in that angle of it. But it really, what I love about it is when you start to apply like traditional story analysis tools to this, they kind of fall apart, because what this story is about kind of a nightmare world where things work backwards, and there are, every attempt that a normal person would take to keep themselves safe actually ends up backfiring and making the victim more apt to be victimized. And I can talk about that more later, but I don't want to monopolize. Yield the floor to my esteemed gentleman.
Yeah, that's funny that you bring that up. traditional kind of storytelling, because, you're looking at it. I mean, just right from the start, there's a lot of like questions of like, who's he talking to? And just the way, like, I mean, I know at the beginning of the episode, we kind of were joking about the way this begins, but it's such like just frantic kind of person just like vomiting out what happens, which I think it's such a neat way of just like, I mean, it's a short story. It's only like 4 pages, but it just gives you so much. And there's just so many different things happening. And just this main character's kind of logic of like everything he does, he kind of has a reason for. Like I kept thinking about how he was like, well, every night at midnight I would go in and I would flash the light on him, and I would slowly put my head in, and I was slower than the minute hand and all this stuff. And like, I couldn't quite tell, like, was he trying to set the old man up like to get ready for it? But we're not supposed to know. Just this is what he's doing, and the light, and then just at the last time where he's like, well, the guy woke up, and I just stayed there for like hours waiting for him, and it just so insane. I love it. I guess to go back to talking about like Poe and just get it the starts. I think I can't tell if The Simpsons Raven came first or if my teacher reading The Raven came first. I mean, those were so kind of tied together at the same time, because I think that first Treehouse of Horror, I think, came out maybe 89 or 90. And I think that was right around 5th grade for me, maybe 5th or 6th. So I could have said early, elementary to middle school was that start. But I just loved it. And I remember the book fair buying like a little collection of Raven and some other stuff. And then like, I don't even know how, but I feel like I know my like favorite story of his is Hop Frog. And I don't know how I got onto that. I just remember specifically, I think it was 7th grade, checking out from the library a big collection and rereading that story like 3 or 4 times. Cause it's just, I don't know. I'm assuming most of you have read Hop Frog, but it's just this wild story about a jester having to get drunk and then finally kind of snaps and kills some people. But, but like, so like that's kind of where the start kind of came from. And then, you would go in and out and kind of read stuff as I was getting older. But, I think this one I probably read in college first, and then just read now. Obviously I just read it. And I don't think I paid attention much to just the insanity that's happening then as I did now, where I'm just like, okay, this is crazy happenings, and it just all makes sense for the main character.
I will say Hop Frog is definitely a really fun Edgar Allan Poe story.
I don't know. It's so funny. I don't know why that one clicked with me at the time, but it did. And so it's like,
right. And not only that, it spawned the nickname for Willem Pugmire, W.H. Pugmire, the late great Lovecraftian author. His nickname was Hop Frog, and that was so derived from the Poe story. And that Poe story is actually more of a morality tale, and occasionally there are stories like that. But I think that this one has a little bit more meat on the bone.
Definitely. I'm trying to think if I thought of it as a morality tale. I can see that, but I don't know. I think my headspace was different, and I was just like, oh, it's just crazy slice of life. And again, I was interested in like who he's telling this to, because I feel like, I'm trying to remember if it wasn't Black Cat, maybe it was the Lovecraft story that we had covered, where it's clear who he's telling. I mean, Lovecraft is always, his stories were always kind of, he's telling somebody about these things. But yeah, I just kept wondering, I'm like, who's he talking to? Is he talking to somebody in jail? Is he talking to us? Is he talking just to nobody? He's just so wanting to tell somebody how smart
he could just be telling it to himself. It's the ravings of a lunatic.
Yeah, that's true.
He does have a point, though. And if I argue the other side of the coin, that maybe he's not insane. One of his points is that, people who have for example, an untreated mental illness, sometimes that, they just executing a kind of plan, over and over, like taking all the steps and kind of being this meticulous would be something that they might find difficult to do. And so, what if he can hear everything that's going on in hell and everything that's going on in heaven? And what if what he's hearing at the end, which I'm going to spoil a story that's like, almost 200 years old.
Go for it.
Yeah, but what if when he's hearing that heart, it's like he actually hearing the heart from hell? Now that's probably not true, but it could. And I think it's more interesting. But I also like just the setting of the story. I mean, for the most part, it's set just in one room. The only setting that really matters is that one room in that one house on that one night.
Yeah.
And that's like the perfect short story is about condensing everything down to that one, limited cast, limited setting, limited span of time. That's what you have in a good short story. And a novel is quite different. You have a big cast of characters. You have a more expanded stretch of time, and you have multiple locations. And if you want to write a novella, then you can mix and match. You can have maybe a small cast of characters over a long period of time, in a handful of settings. Those are, I think, the three levers that as a writer you can manipulate to kind of decide, like, okay, what is this going to be, a novel or a short story or a novella? And I think here Poe does a really good job of kind of keeping this into this nightmarish realm of, you have two characters in the middle of the night and a completely black room, and the only light that you have is shining onto this vulture eye, which for whatever reason is perturbing our protagonist. And so now we're not, I think we're almost in this place where madness or sanity really doesn't, those kind of categories kind of fall apart, and what we're left with is this, completely irrational experience of, the motivations. There are motivations, but the motivations don't really add up logically. And even at the end, I think the story is really more about self-destruction and about like what Poe called the imp of the perverse. This idea that wanting to do the wrong thing because it was the wrong thing, and kind of like this propensity that people have to, delay a project until the very last minute, and then know that the deadline's coming, but then continue to procrastinate, and then the deadline fails, and this kind of craving that some people have for suffering. And it's kind of about that. It's kind of about this nightmarish atmosphere event, and I mean, at least at the end, I feel I'm like rooting for the madman. I'm like, no, don't point out the floorboards. I think, I think most readers are probably, kind of at least part of the story sympathizing with the madman and saying, like, we're rooting for him not to reveal what he has buried beneath his floorboards. And that's a very unique dynamic too.
Yeah, I was definitely feeling that way, especially like when he's got the police in the room, and I think it's interesting the way he does it. But you're sitting there and he's really happy and he's talking to these police, and then he starts hearing it, and I love it. It's just like a couple sentences of him like getting up and walking and yelling and arguing about stuff, and we don't know what it is. It's because it's he's just like doing it, but we're in it's almost automatic while we're seeing his thoughts. So he's kind of an autopilot of just like stomping around and arguing, and then he's like, well, how come the police aren't doing anything? They're just smiling, they know what's happening. And throughout all of that is exactly what you're saying. I was like, no, you're so close to making it through this. It's just like just stop and let them go.
Yeah. I know we had talked about that with the Black Cat previously, yes, where it's the same kind of finale where it's kind of like, you are almost through with this. Why are you drawing so much attention to this? Just shut your mouth and let the cops leave. Like, in the Black Cat, you've got your wife buried in the wall, and you're like, oh, look at this fine masonry job I did. There's definitely nobody buried behind these lovely bricks. And it's like, why? Why are you doing this?
It completes the circle of nonsense.
Yeah.
and that might have been intentional. I mean, one of my favorite parts of this story, and I have to brag a little bit on my Poe collection. I recently happened to stumble onto this edition of Poe from like 1927. So I'm reading this today. I read it out of my 1927 edition of Poe. Where the pages are nicely faded and everything, edition. But there's this part of the story where, let me see if I can find it here. Oh, yeah. So he's opening the door little by little. And he says, I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now, you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were closed fastened through fear of robbers. And so the old man puts up his shutters because he's afraid of the threat from without. He's afraid of robbers coming in and doing him harm. So he closes the shutters. What effect does that have on our story? Well, it makes the room completely pitch black and makes it so that the threat from within can go ahead and kill the old man. And so the world is working backwards. The very thing that the old man did to try to make the world safe ended up blowing up in his face and making it so that he could be killed. And so, again, you have this inversion of reality where, things that should make you safer end up making you more vulnerable. And that is part of the story. That's where it's kind of like almost Lynchian in my estimation. It's like there's something not right. The world is not adding up. What you do what you can do things that have very logical thoughts to it, and logic doesn't prevail. This is about the triumph of irrationality. And I love it because of that. Because guess what? If you've been paying attention over the last 4 or 5 years, the triumph of irrationality is alive and well. And we are not a rational species. Getting back to Whitley Strieber, we are not a rational species. Whatever experience he had, I will grant that he must have had some kind of experience. I don't think it was completely mercenary of him to just make something up and try peddling it. I think he probably did have some kind of experience that's completely irrational, but also in his brain at least completely real. And so there we go, the triumph of irrationality. And that is something that I'm very interested in. And the older I get, the more I become convinced that the world is not rational and that we are all in the dark at midnight. And there might be someone in the door wanting to hurt us, or there might be a circus clown by that door, or there might be a marching band by that door, or there might be an orange toad who kind of has taken over the White House for 4 years,
yeah.
And who thinks that he's going to be reinstalled. By the way, and has lots of minions who think that he's going to be including the gentleman who owns a pillow company. And this is the triumph of irrationality writ large. Poe wrote it small and did it with this kind of vertiginous experience, this vertigo experience of horror, but it's also, taken in a different context. You can play with that same energy, and you can do things with satire. You can do things with just the horror of satire. That's kind of also what I'm writing about right now. I'm finishing a novel right now, and it's kind of like these moments that are equally like bizarre and funny, and at the same time very dark and very disturbing. And all these emotions are triggered simultaneously because of the world we live in. And, the fact that I can mention that in the same podcast as I'm mentioning Poe really tells you about the enduring power of his work, I think. That he's really the author of nightmares. He's the author of unreality, and that's what I love so much.
Definitely. I mean, and I think that with, especially, just the fact that it was the blue eye that sets this kind of all into motion, I think is is exactly that. It's just like, you don't know. I mean, he even says, he's like, I don't know. It got to me. And I think that's just exactly that. It's the one random thing, and it just kind of can spiral into so much of what's happening here, all because just as I would look at him. I mean,
right.
And it's just so crazy. Like, it's just this random bit of a thing. And like, you can look at that with the other stuff too, with the lantern and the shining of the light on it. And then, I think it's interesting too, is he uses the mattress to kill the old man, and, he can hear the heart even before he attacks. I think that you kind of had mentioned that. And I think that's an interesting thing that kind of goes through. It's all the hearing, and how his senses are kind of more acute. And I think that's, again, it's just this kind of weird thing that sets this all off and can affect everything in it. It's just really interesting. And I think it's interesting too, that it's such a big section of this story is that while he's waiting for the man to either go back to sleep or, forget that he's there. I mean, again, like I said, it's only 4 pages, and probably about a page and a half of it is him in the doorway just listening while he's, checking to make sure the old man isn't awake. And I think he even talks about all the stuff the old man is probably thinking. Oh, it's a mouse, it's a cricket, it's the wind. I think that I love that stuff for the suspense of what's happening. I think that's really cool.
I feel like this story kind of tells you everything about what a horror story should be, or what it helps me it helps guide me to the definition of what, in my opinion, horror fiction is. Because in this story, you have what I believe are the 3 elements of horror. The first element is unease, right? And so we have unease from the very beginning. The second quality in a horror story, in my opinion, is a sense of unreality. And we have that, all throughout the story, but even from the very beginning. And the third ingredient is a sense of grandeur, that things are larger than life, that the unreality is larger than life. And so, it's not just that he's hearing people down the street with his super hearing. He's hearing things that are being streamed from hell. And that kind of brings everything up to this more magnificent, more grandiose level where he's, kind of poised on this fulcrum of all existence. He can hear what's going on in heaven and hell. It's kind of like, what's all this about? And so, I mean, and so I think that if you look at horror stories in general, you can kind of see those 3 ingredients going throughout it. And what oftentimes I found separates a horror story from just a run-of-the-mill kind of disturbing literary fiction story or something is that literary fiction or crime fiction or those other kinds of things lack the quality of grandeur. If you just have unease and unreality, maybe you have like Kafka, but you don't have a sense of grandeur because in Kafka everything is happening like in some kitchen or whatever, and it's all about the bureaucracy and family relations kind of going astray. Or you have Camus or something, but the tone is very kind of low key. The tone doesn't reach a degree of grandeur. Whereas with Poe, the tone is grand, it's kind of fever pitched, it's kind of operatic, and at the same time very intense and very short. So it's not long like an opera, but it certainly has that operatic sort of grandeur to it that I think really is effective for horror. And so whenever I'm writing, I kind of think about that. I think about like, okay, is this horror? Does it have grandeur to it? Does it have unreality? Does it have a sense of unease throughout it? And if it has all those 3 things, I think it's horror. And so, my work in progress, I think probably meets those 3 criteria, although there's also, a lot of dark humor in it too. So.
I would expect some humor with anything regarding your work too.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I don't try to be funny. It's like, but it's just from my earliest age. From childhood, it was a coping mechanism for a lot of the, kind of, weird and dark stuff that was happening in my life. So. I can remember my brother and I collaborating on, like, we would watch these sitcoms and we would write these, like screenplays or teleplays, I guess technically, to these sitcoms, and we would sometimes put a horror element in it. So it would be like, I could distinctly remember this was a real project my brother and I collaborated on. It was called Sanford and Son Meet the Werewolf, and and it was like there was one of the cast was a werewolf, and they had to determine who it was. And of course, Fred Sanford was very, kind of irritated about all this, and so that was a big part of my upbringing, is kind of like, a survival mechanism of finding the funny side of things and, marinating in it, and also not being able to look away from the darkness. And so here we don't have much in the way of humor with Mr. Poe, at least not in this story. He did write humorous stories. He wrote satires. He wrote a lot of different things. He's known as the founder of the detective story genre. He wrote a little bit of science fiction, and before science fiction was even really a thing. He wrote a nonfiction treatise on the nature of reality. He was really brilliant. He was probably also just a gigantic asshole from everything I've learned about him. I would not want to be like, I would not want to go to like the convention, run in and like have like, a little like cocktail party conversation with Poe. I mean, he would be, I think, just completely obnoxious, and even all the more obnoxious because he would be so goddamn talented, And so you have this completely, talk about unreality. You have like this completely unjust, completely inexplicable commingling of talent and just residing in a total reprobate. But sometimes that's how it works. I mean, being a talented writer doesn't mean that you're necessarily a responsible or even reasonably ethical person. And it's oftentimes, writers are shady people.
When I approached you about coming onto the show, you mentioned how the Telltale Heart was the inspiration for the murder scene in Mr. Suicide.
Yeah, I mean, I realized when I was writing Mr. Suicide that, there's a scene about 2/3 of the way through where some blood is shed, and I only realized it kind of after the fact. And it's like, oh, I have this young man and I have an old man, and I have this little thin ray of light entering into this cramped little space in the middle of the night. I have this murder that's happening, and I have this very, kind of like the murderer justifying it in a way that's very unreal. And then I looked at it, it's like, holy shit. It's like, oh my God, there it is. It's this influence from Poe that I didn't even know existed until I looked at it, and it's like, holy shit, that's right. That's Eddie in my DNA coming out. And probably not the only example of that. I admire Poe's work tremendously because of how irrational it can be, and because of how, and if you get into some of the stories, they're, the lesser known stories. There's one called William Wilson, which is kind of one of these kinds of stories that's very, very strange, and, something more along the lines of what you would think of coming from like a Kafka or, a Ligotti or something like that. There's a story I have like this annotated edition of Poe, and I read a couple stories in there, but like in general, just the lesser known stories, the ones that have not been adapted into movies by Roger Corman and Vincent Price, they have a lot of just genius in them. And, to the point where like, it takes a lot to take my breath away. And there are some of these stories that just take my breath away. That is like, how did he do that? and then going back and rereading them and finding out how he did it and looking at it. And then also reading some of his nonfiction work about the writing process, I find interesting. You can't always take it at face value because he's very interested, I think, in how he comes across. But there's a Library of America edition of Edgar Allan Poe's, collected works, which includes his nonfiction. And it's just interesting to hear him talk about writing,
I didn't know he had come out with that. I have to hunt that down.
Yeah, definitely look it up. It's in the library. It's in a lot of other Poe editions. My little 1920 edition of Poe has a lot of that stuff in there too. But yeah, I mean, Poe is, and this is one of the reasons why, it's like when I propose the story to y'all, I realize, okay, it's like the Telltale Heart. We all read that in like middle school. We all know what it's about. It's kind of like dull. But there's, I really feel like we as a field need to reevaluate Poe and kind of dust off, what we think we know about Poe and re-engage him because there's so much brilliance there. And, it's not just for Poe's sake, but for our own sake to find, new avenues to go through. I think there is in horror fiction, there's, yes, we stand on the shoulders of giants, but we don't necessarily stand on the shoulders of giants to look down at the giants, right? We want to strive for more and go beyond where even they went and to within the scope of our abilities. And I think, to go, like, I see a lineage between Poe and Ligotti, and Lovecraft certainly too, but I'm more intrigued by Poe than I am by Lovecraft. But it's kind of like it's another one of these things of like finding your lineage, just like I mentioned, like reading this transgressive fiction from 16th century or 17th century Spain. Just kind of finding your forebears and kind of seeing what path you want to take, and kind of, each of them kind of went up Mount Everest, and they kind of, got to a certain point, and they set up a base camp, and you can, you can stay at that base camp, or you can continue on up the mountain. And so it's important to know about Poe, because by knowing about Poe, you can know about that aspect of Poe that shows up in Ligotti. And then you learn about Ligotti, and then you, forge ahead from the base camp of Ligotti and find your way up the mountain the best you can. And so learning what you've learned from all these forebears, and not just, those dudes, but, Sylvia Plath and, certainly Shirley Jackson. I mean, I think Shirley Jackson wrote the greatest horror novel of all time, Haunting of Hill House.
Yeah.
Julia Butler, Bloodchild. I mean, there are, know your forebears and then try as much as possible to extend beyond them. I think that's what I tried to do.
I think it's something you succeed at doing with your work.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I try, and within the scope of my limits. Sometimes I think the comedic aspect of it, handicaps it to some degree. Because if I were more, comedy in horror, or satire in horror, that mix, I think, can kind of be okay. This is kind of a side dish. This isn't the main course, right? It's kind of like it's not. I'm not sure how it bodes for, the future reception of my work or whatever, but it is who I am. I'm kind of like the, it's like I can't change who I am, and I'm kind of like the, morbid jester, and who depresses people but sometimes makes them laugh too, and. And I guess there's something valuable in that.
Yeah, I wanted to real quick to go back. It's interesting that you bringing up Poe and like looking back, because you can. I mean, obviously, there's a ton of people looking back at Lovecraft, and they have for years, and there's everything like that. And I feel like currently there's a little bit of a resurgence with Shirley Jackson, at least what I've noticed rumblings of that, just kind of seeing people really bring her stuff up more. But it's interesting with Poe because you're right, like we do need to dust him off a little bit more. I don't hear that much, and maybe there is, and I'm blind to it, but I don't like when you look at like the anthologies they're inspired by or the authors that are inspired by, you see that lean towards, say, more towards Lovecraft than Poe. You don't, at least I haven't heard like authors and people are like, oh, this is just like Poe, or this is clear, it's and it's interesting to like think of that, because I mean, and you brought up all the points on like why you should look at him, and I just don't quite, I guess that's a good question, is why is he sort of a little bit, say, dustier than everybody else currently?
Well, there's no Poe emblem, like, there's no like cool monster attached to Poe. So with Lovecraft resurgence, is it really that people are interested in the idea of cosmicism, or is it that there's almost like a kaiju factor there with Cthulhu, where it's kind of like, this is a cool monster that we can get into, and there's this cool mythos, and the stories are kind of interrelated, so that encourages further reading into and there was no grand mythos happening with Poe, and I also think Poe. So there's not the escapism factor that there is with Lovecraft, although I know a lot of people would take umbrage to Lovecraft being considered escapist, but there is an aspect of like the Call of Cthulhu where it's this, you're going to far-flung areas of the world, and it's kind of, you can almost imagine like this 1920s kind of serial or 1930s kind of serial kind of thing going on, like, Dateline, South America, Dateline, this island, this is happening, all this, and the piecing of it all together, it kind of gets into the spirit of adventure that was what the pulp magazines were really about. Whereas with Poe, I mean, it's really, dare I say it? I mean, I think Poe is more, for one thing, Poe's more interested in human beings. I mean, Lovecraft, I think himself admitted that he really wasn't interested in human beings or human personalities, whereas Poe was passionately interested in human beings and personalities. He was, passionately human, what for good or for ill. He was very much, putting his heart on his sleeve, and was more of the world, I think, than Lovecraft. I think Lovecraft was more detached in some ways. He had his circle, and he was not a recluse by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't think that Lovecraft would have felt comfortable like going to a bar and just kind of, crying like good old Eddie did. So I think that, Poe, he's just like really more tortured, and torture doesn't sell. Cool monsters sell. Even when Poe arguably had his heyday in pop culture in the 60s, it was by, kind of changing the Poe stories into morality tales. Like if you see, the Mask of the Red Death, the film with Vincent Price, it's, Prince Prospero is now a Satanist, which he never is in Bury. And you had, I think it was Charles Beaumont who wrote the screenplay for that one. So he does a very interesting thing of melding. He combines the story of Hop Frog and the story of the Mask of the Red Death into one screenplay. And he does it kind of effectively, but it does turn it into a morality tale. And I think that's because that's like the easy way out of interpreting Poe's work. And it's a lot harder to kind of say, okay, no, there's something else going on here that has the flavor of nightmare. And that's not something that can be, kind of put on a tray for mass consumption. Yeah. And, so.
Yeah, that makes sense. The concept of like his whole mythos, I mean, especially now, I think that makes a lot of sense, because you got like, Star Wars and Marvel and everything now is so wanting to be interconnected. And you're right, with Lovecraft, it's very easy to say, well, I'm going to do something interconnected, and I can take these things and write my my stuff that's somewhat similar. You know, I'm going to put tentacles and monsters in there. So yeah, yes, that exactly. And and which is too bad because I like this, I like that kind of concept of more human stuff. And, and we brought up Mr. Suicide now to jump back to the other point that I was going to. And, I think the humor in there for you, like, at least for me reading it, like, I think helps because that is such like a tough subject where I loved it, but I needed those little bit of moments just to help kind of process everything. So I appreciate that you put that stuff in there.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it just kind of flowed at, I was kind of strategic about like how transgressive I got. I remember at one point I was so obsessive about it that I actually like gave each chapter a transgressiveness score and plotted on a graph. To kind of like make sure it wasn't too much all at once. It's like, so I would have like a little bit of a ebb and flow with it. So there was a lot of kind of thinking about it, but the humor a lot of places is just organic. It's because the world is a funny place, and even like tortured souls are also funny people. And I say that as somebody who was formerly tortured and. Not like like a POW camp or anything, but formerly a tortured soul, and intermittently, occasionally a tortured soul. But also, my way of looking at the world is this kind of cartoon nightmare energy, like this kind of gross sideshow, that. Where people think they're in their main 3-ring circus, but we're all in the sideshow. We all have our weirdness to us, and either physical weirdness, like I have arthritis, and like as I'm looking at my pinky right now, like my pinky is veering away, like from the knuckle joint up to like this. 30-degree angle from the rest of my, it's like, that's kind of gross, it's like, my toes aren't looking much better, and it's only going to get worse with age, and it's like, if age can do something like that to my bones, like what can it do to my brain? Because my bones are made of really hard material. My brain's made of softer material. So does that mean my brain's going to warp too? It's just kind of like, we're all kind of grotesque. And so it's, what can you do but kind of revel in it to the degree you can, and say, yes, I accept that I'm grotesque, and I'm and that everyone's grotesque to one degree or another, and let's just kind of revel in it and not really hold ourselves up to any kind of notion of normality. Normality is vastly overrated, and as we've seen, normality in current affairs have been gone out the window in the United States, at least for a number of years now, and makes me the fact that it was so easily overturned, normality that is, leads me to wonder how secure it ever was.
I was just thinking about the half freaks and being, what was it? I'm a regular guy.
Oh yeah, the half freaks. I'm a working man. I'm a working man. It's like, yeah.
And to like bring that back to this, you could, not saying there's total similarities, but the concept of like the way he's telling the story, and then the way the main character is telling the story in A Telltale Heart, where it's this very like, this is who I am, and this is what I did.
Yeah, I mean, at least the narrator of the Telltale Heart, has no shame. He's not, he's not like, he doesn't have hang-ups, and I think we can at least salute him for that.
Yeah, he doesn't. That's a good point. He definitely is just like, nothing. It doesn't bother him that he's doing this. He's just like, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, if it were a morality tale, then he would feel like, suitably chastened. But, and at the end he would, I learned my lesson. I can't hear things. And, but even if it's, let's say that he is insane, then the story is, it's still nonsensical because, okay, so that means that, at any point, somebody that you trust might come in and murder you in the middle of the night, and you think that everything is okay. And, your life can be taken, by someone who just doesn't like your eye. I mean, that's like the triumph of irrationality. Or if you're the state, what do you do with this person? Well, are you what are the cops going to do? Are they going to execute somebody who was acting out of their mental illness? It's criminally responsible. I mean, probably not. So, but if he's executed for it, then that's an act of irrationality on the part of the state. And so, yeah, I mean, it gets a lot messier if you start to look at it in all of its, like, what would happen next, or et cetera.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if we talked about it. You'd brought it up at the beginning of this, but talking about who the protagonist and antagonist are was thinking about it, and like my silly side would say it was the blue eye was the antagonist, and because that kind of started it all. But even to go with us rooting for him at the end, it's like, well, does that make him the protagonist because we're rooting for him?
There's a protagonist we can root for. That's like what every commercial, New York wants. Give me a protagonist I can root for. Here you go. I mean, and it's also interesting. Eyes, Poe and eyes. It's like, didn't he gouged out the eye of the cat and the black cat?
Yeah.
The eye of this old man that really bugs him. It's like, what was it about eyes, Eddie? I need to know. Like is that kind of like it's some kind of like being afraid of people watching you? Is that what that's about? Or about, people seeing something about you that you might not want them to see, or is it just he found eyes really creepy? It's like,
I think he probably just found eyes really creepy.
Yeah.
But one thing I think that is something I notice in a lot of Poe stories, I mean, some of his more kind of like mainstream stories, is not so much the morality aspect to them, but the idea of like the dead, or I should say the power the dead have over the living.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like in the Telltale Heart, this body is by all means cut into pieces, but yet our protagonist is still succumbed to what he did, but also the power of this killing and what it's had on him. Mm-hmm. And even to juxtapose that with like the Raven and how the power of the dead affects the narrator to the Raven, you see it kind of commonly throughout a lot of Edgar Allan Poe stories.
That's an excellent observation, I think. And it's certainly what we know about Poe's life. I mean, certainly all the women he loved died, and probably some of the other folks in his life that, he was living in a time where tuberculosis was rampant, and it took a lot of people who he loved away, a lot of the women who he loved away in particular. And then the people and his parents away. I mean, I don't know if his parents died of tuberculosis, but both of his parents died, or his mom died, and I think the dad just left and was never heard from again. So he was raised by foster parents. That's where he got the middle name Allen. It came from his foster father at John Allen, who wanted him to, stop dreaming and be a normal person and everything. And that wasn't going to happen. And of course, great amount of rivalry and everything. So, I mean, there was just so much death after death after death after death in this man's life. And, he definitely, I think, that's where life was imitated in art, much to the benefit of our genre, if not the benefit of Poe.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
The other thing that I think we talked about with the Black Cat was a lot of people are buried in houses, which we were trying to figure that out with the Black Cat. If that was like a common occurrence back then, or if that was just him coming up with something creepy to do.
Or either they're buried in houses, or they're buried prematurely, or. I mean, it's, I mean, what can you say about that? It's definitely there. And so is it is it about, the dead always being around us? Is it about the dead, being inescapable and, the dead being always with us? Is it about the dead kind of almost haunting the house? Or is it about, houses not being a safe place or a place, you could do some armchair psychology with that and see where young Eddie would have kind of been moving up. But it's a very, I think it's, in a way, you think about this, it's like, okay, I'm not very handy, so, I couldn't lift up floorboards or or, take out a bunch of drywall and put a body there, so I guess it was, maybe he was more handy, or at least his protagonists were handy, to do it very quickly and efficiently, after being up all night. But, it's definitely there, and it's something to ponder.
It's the part of Poe we didn't know is he had a construction business at the time. He was
he did a lot of masonry in his free time. It was
a construction business with a side of interior design.
Yeah. He's like, you know what? This would be a good spot to hide somebody.
There you go.
It's where the mafia got their ideas, were from Poe.
Edgar Allan Poe.
That's a nice idea. Literate mafioso. I'll take it.
Edgar Allan Poe would be like,
they read
see
some
this
Poe,
wall?
and then they went after Hoffa, and like, hey, you know what? We can do this.
Edgar Allan Poe's like, you see this wall? You could fit a body in there.
You could fit 3-4 people in this wall.
Nice and sturdy. You can smack it. Try it. Oh my goodness. Yes.
This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed it.
Before we wrap everything up, if you have anything you'd like to promote or anything that's coming out you'd like to promote, feel free to do so.
As I've mentioned, right now I'm finishing a novel. I don't want to say too much about it other than I've been intrigued by the paranormal, and so more intrigued about the paranormal than I've ever been before. And so part of that novel is the fruit of that intrigue. Other than that, I can say that I've really put a lot of emphasis on Patreon. I have a catalog of writing advice that I have used, posted there now for about 2 years. So there's over 100, different posts about writing tips. I do a writing class every month where I kind of, propose. I have a little, outline of notes and everything, or a little essay, and then a video introduction to it. And I also can send you very strange postcards with doodles that I draw, very nightmarish figures for the most part. And I send those out to people. That's one of my little Patreon things. So patreon.com/Nicole Cushing is primarily what you'll get inside updates into what's going on as I finish this novel, and along with all the writing instruction and whatnot. We have a pretty good community over there right now, and we're always looking for more. And then also, stay tuned for new news about this novel, probably in the next few months. And also feel free to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, etc. It's NicoleCushing. A lot of people want to put an H in Nicole. There is no H in Nicole. It's just NicoleCushing. No relation to Peter Cushing, unfortunately. I come from far more redneck stock. But yeah, it's I've really enjoyed being on here, and I really appreciate the discussion and the opportunity to share time with y'all.
Yeah, I will say before you start, Rich, is the Patreon is amazing. I'm on it. I love everything. I love even the book suggestions or what you're reading is great. I picked up, and this was a long time ago, but I picked up Benighted per your suggestion. Yeah. And I loved reading that. That was such I'd never read it or heard it. I mean, I've heard of the old Dark House stuff, but it was really awesome to read that. So yes, for anybody, it's a great Patreon. So
thank you.
No problem.
Awesome. And Matt, where can our listeners get in touch with you at?
I am on Twitter at BrandenburgDM.
And Mike, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at MikeH5856.
And you can follow me at Rudy53088. And we'll be back next week with a discussion about Island by Richard Lehman.
It's going to be a lot of rants.
And this is Richard Gerlach saying, keeps staring.
Bizong!
It's Bizong, the Bizarre and Weird Fiction Podcast, hosted by me, Mr. Frank. Bizong is the showcase podcast of the bizarro fiction genre. And those who write weird and read weird are going to love this podcast, where each week we talk to everyone who is anyone in the bizarre and weird fiction realm. So join us here every Monday, presented exclusively by Project Entertainment Network.
This has been a presentation of the Project Entertainment Network.